Welcome, Rukmini.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you on Wealthy Wednesdays in our story tribe. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Me too.
So, people, Rukmini and I are friends. We have known each other since 2008 because that's the year when Rukmini moved back to Mumbai from Singapore. And we happen to be in the same Toastmasters club. One thing I gained out of Toastmasters is some beautiful relationships, and this is one of those relationships that have survived the test of time and distance because we have been friends for 12 years, and this is one of the most precious relationships that I have. So, thank you so much for being there, Rukmini. Rukmini is also my coach. She is my go to coach, she's my go to mentor, and she is also my go to kick up the arse person because she is one person who never shies away from holding up the mirror, no matter how hard the truth is, no matter how brutal the truth is. And she doesn't say nice things to me just because I want her to be in my corner. Because her view is when she would do right by me, that's when she would be in my corner. And I'm very grateful for that love and support and friendship. Welcome, Rukmini.
Thank you.
So let's get
I
started.
can't believe it's 12 years, but it's
Yeah,
been
it's
such a
been 12
joy.
years. My God. we were we were youngsters when we had met, not anymore.
Oh, yeah.
I had my big birthday 2 years ago. 2 years in
I'll
two
have mine
weeks.
this year.
You'll have
So,
yours this year. So yeah, we are not young people anymore. Although I do like the opportunity of growing old, to be very honest. I like that.
yeah, it's I guess, a lot more freeing than young days used to be. So,
Absolutely. So, why don't we start by understanding a little about you? What is your story, Rukmini? And then we will delve into the topic for our conversation today, which is our heroic story. So, tell us a little bit about you and your story.
well, I guess if I have to look at an overarching theme of the story, it's about evolution, really. And I guess the more I go along, the more conscious that evolution gets. So that would perhaps be the best way to capture the story. Um, so if you have to look at the professional arc, it started off with a corporate career and a successful one at that, in the sense that in the first 8 years that I was working employed in different corporate spaces in India and in Singapore, the growth was fairly vertical. I mean, in terms of the hierarchical part of it, and at the same time, there was a constant sense of lack of meaning, and that, the feeling that there's something more to life than this. So, which logically did not make sense, and I mean, to give you an idea, like the very first job that I took up after graduating from university, within 6 months I was heading the department, and that was the trajectory of growth. And I don't mean it from an arrogant perspective in terms of look how I grew, but it was easy in that sense. Maybe I was in the right place at the right time and all of that. And yet the more I guess one part of me that was very alive even as I was working in business spaces was a very active volunteering side, which means I was constantly in touch with the community around me through various organizations like Rotaract, and later with Toastmasters, where we met. And so there was always a service side of me which was very alive, and so I was tuned into things that were happening in the world beyond the idea of making profits, which is what we are present to when we're employed or in business, right? And so there was a constant questioning around, when we talk of this term world peace, and we aspire for world peace and all of that, what does that mean for a lay person like me? And growing up, the only contexts in which I thought this conversation around peace was relevant was on the one extreme, people like Mother Teresa, who kind of gave up everything and dedicated herself to peace and service. And on the other extreme, you have Miss Worlds and Miss Universes talking about, we need world peace. But then there's nothing in between. So I didn't know what that meant for me. And yet, growing up in a household where there was a lot of domestic violence, and in that context, it was also about saying, okay, is there a role for peace in individual lives? If conflict resides in us and in our lives, in our very mundane, so-called normal lives, then the possibility of peace also needs to exist there. So that question kept nagging me throughout my corporate career. And so one fine day in 2008, woke up in Singapore, perfect life, everything set, and all of that. And I said, okay, I can't do this anymore. And that was that. So within a fortnight of that, I was back in India with no plan. And all I knew was I wanted to do something which was meaningful. I was enjoying the corporate work I was doing in terms of leadership and organization development. So I wanted to continue that because I was good at it and because I was enjoying it, but also wanted to do more than that. So that was the only idea I had when I came back to India. No business plan whatsoever. And the last 12 years have been about allowing for emergence, allowing to see how these two aspects of the business and the peace building sides of me come together. And yeah, it's been quite a ride in terms of balancing the two, and to also shift my own narrative around the fact that it's not an either or, it's not about profit or peace, but we can co-hold it if we're able to work with systems within and without consciously. So it's the last 12 years, I guess, have been an exploration around that.
Oh, wow. What a journey. What a journey. Tell us a little bit more about this peace-based work that you are doing. I know that isn't the focus of today's conversation, because we could talk for hours about the peace building work you are doing, but this is something all of us need in the world today. So I'm very keen to hear from you what you're doing. That's one. And second, how can we start adapting and bringing in peace at an individual level? So speak to us about that.
So my early years in peace building were largely in post-conflict countries, like spaces like Thailand and Cambodia, post-Civil War sort of contexts, where most part of the work was what's termed as conflict analysis, which means you try and figure out why wars happened. And at some point that did not make sense, in the sense of waiting for war to happen and then trying to figure out why it does. Somehow just it didn't make sense anymore after a while. So I moved from that consciously to the preventive side of peace building, which is peace education and dialogue. So the last few years, most of the work in this space has been around creating spaces for dialogue, largely work on the Indo-Pak front and a little bit on the Israel-Arab conflict. And a lot of the work has been, like I said, creating dialogue spaces and also creating learning spaces where particularly youth, young adults, and even teenagers can learn tangible, applicable tools for peace building that they can take back to their schools, communities, families, and so on. So when you talk of what is it that you and I can do in terms of peace building, I guess one of my firm beliefs is that the conflicts that we see outside at our borders is largely because we've not managed those conflicts within our homes and within ourselves, within our individual selves. So wherever we breach an inner boundary, it reflects in the external borders, and that's where active participation of each and every one of us is important in peace building, in terms of, can we actively engage in conflicts in our day-to-day lives, with our family members, with our communities, in our schools. What it looks like in practicality would be speaking up, and creating safe spaces where day-to-day manifestations of conflict, like, let's say, bullying in schools, or sexual harassment at work, or even family conflicts, or community, religion, caste-based conflicts, can these be uh, in a way looked at through a conversation? I'm not necessarily talking of being resolved, but at least can we create safe spaces to speak about them? Because overall, if you look at the idea of conflict, I think it's really essential. We don't grow when there is no conflict. So it's essential that we have conflicts in our lives, and it's also essential that we have the will to engage with those conflicts. The conflicts aren't here to destroy us or to destroy our relationships or our structures. They're there to point at the next level of growth. And can we engage with that, with that understanding that here's an opportunity for growth for me?
Oh, wow. You just gave me goosebumps, literally. When you said that whenever we breach an inner boundary, it reflects in the outside world. Wow, that was just so amazing. What you said about when you were working with the in places like Thailand and Cambodia in the post-war scenario, that reminds me of this anecdote I had read in context of Mother Teresa, wherein somebody, I don't remember the whole context, somebody approached her and they asked her, we are going to be out on the streets, and we are going to be doing an anti-war protest. Will you walk with us? And she said, no. Come and talk to me the day you do a pro-peace protest. But that's what I'm reminded of. So that's really, really beautiful. I think it's a story that all of us have learned, that conflict is a bad thing, and we have accepted that because it makes us uncomfortable. And I think it makes us uncomfortable because it's literally pushing our comfort zone boundaries, whatever that means to people. So yes, I feel that when I find myself in conflict, it is a huge growth opportunity for me, because irrespective of how uncomfortable it is being in that conflicting situation, what follows after that is hugely transformational. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our heroic journeys. What do you mean when you say our heroic journeys?
Actually, one can take off from where you left off, in the sense that uh, Joseph Campbell, of course, spoke of the framework of what he called the hero's journey, and uh, that's a framework that I often use in both corporate leadership development work and with working with individuals and communities. And the reason I find that framework relevant is because it speaks to the heroism that's called forth by life in all of us. So it's not so much about a hero as in a male character, but really a heroic journey. And the heroic journey starts with conflicts, right? It starts with a given system or a given state of order being disrupted. Right? And we see the heroic journey being reflected in practically every story, every myth, every folktale, every movie that's made. We see the heroic journey being reflected, right? Like if you look at Harry Potter, for example, right? He's living a fairly comfortable life, not pleasant, not that he's happy, but it's comfortable in the sense he has food to eat, there's shelter at his aunt's place where he's adopted. And the first conflict that turns up in his life is where there's a letter from the school, and he comes to know that he's not an ordinary person, he's not a muggle but a wizard. And that's the first sense of conflict, right? That what I believed is my identity is not true, right? And that invitation into the adventure, into what Campbell calls the special world, is it's such a beautiful opportunity for growth. Of course, it's extremely scary. For a lot of us spend a large part of our lives trying to refuse that call to adventure, because it can disrupt everything that we know about ourselves, about our environment, and all of that. And yet, imagine if Harry Potter had discarded that letter and said, "Okay, I'm not going to go to school." Right? The story ended right there. Right? So it's so essential to say yes to life when that call to adventure comes in, when that conflict erupts, and you're told, you're no longer who you thought you were. And that conflict emerges for us in multiple ways. For some of us, it is in terms of a breakdown in a relationship. It could be moving from success to so-called failure in a business. It could be where there's a loss of a dear one. It could be where there's a major health challenge. Either any which way, what you were no longer holds true, right? And a lot of times we try and spend a lot of time and energy and effort trying to retain a false sense of identity which is no longer true, right? And it's important, therefore, for our heroism to emerge, for us to be able to say yes to that sense of adventure. But when there's a bad breakup, when my business is going downhill, when my health is in bad shape, for me to look at saying, all right, old sense of identity, old habits, old ways of behavior, old ways of relating to people or to myself are no longer working. So what's life trying to tell me? And that's where we come to. So if I were to talk of Campbell's framework in 4 simple words, it starts with a crisis, which is where the conflict enters. The second stage is trauma, in the sense that everything around you is breaking down. And then there's transformation and there's rebirth, right? So a lot of times for us, we try and not acknowledge the conflict, or we refuse the call to adventure with the hope that if we don't do that, the trauma will not exist. But the point is that conflict has erupted, the crisis has erupted because the trauma is already present, whether you acknowledge it or not. You have to deal with it one way or another. And I mean, I'd like to believe that life, in its innate compassion, gives us multiple opportunities to ease into that trauma. It's only when we ignore enough calls to adventure that we're kind of dragged into it with no choice. And yet, when we say trauma, it's largely where so a part of my work is as a trauma therapist, right? So one very interesting definition that I find about trauma is where the body finds that something happened in a way that was too much or too fast, right? Where I'm suddenly in this space where, for example, if you were to talk of a physical trauma, right? Let's say an accident or a serious terminal ailment or something like that. For the body, it's trauma because something happened too fast, like a vehicle came at me in a manner that I could not respond fast enough, or there was too much. I mean, there was a diagnosis that's too big for me to handle, right? And similarly, trauma at every level is about that. There's too much happening too fast, mentally, emotionally, physically, at whatever layer the trauma occurs, right? And the trauma phase of the heroic journey is really about acknowledging that, all right, this has happened, and how do I work with it? How do I, at whatever level the trauma has occurred, how do I now align the rest of me to that reality, right? So let's say, for example, the trauma has occurred for me at a physical level. So I've got a diagnosis which is not too great. Now, that physically the body is already in trauma. Now, how do I bring my mental and my emotional and my spiritual space to align with that, to say, okay, can I bring myself to mourn what's happening with my body? Can I allow myself full emotional expression to express whatever is happening to me physically, right? So can I bring myself in complete alignment with the trauma, which could be happening at whichever layer? So any of these layers can be an entry point into the trauma, right? So it could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be mental. So for example, if the trauma comes in the form of a loss of a relationship or a breakdown, then the doorway is emotional. Now, can I bring my body along and my mind along, right? Whichever is the pathway, can I align the rest of me there? And come to think of it, that trauma phase of the journey is really about that, to just bring all of you into alignment, to say yes to life in that moment, to say that yes, my life is crappy in this moment.
Yeah.
And it's crappy because the way I was, what I was doing, the environment I was in was not working any longer. And therefore, how do I do things differently? How do I live differently? And that's the transformation. The moment we start asking ourselves that question around, what's the opportunity here? How do I start doing things differently? Then the transformation occurs. It's not something that we do, but it's something that we become. And as we transform and we stabilize into, uh, I don't quite like to use the term, but I can't quite find an alternative, the new normal, right? The moment we find a new normal, we start rebirthing, in the sense that we start interacting with the world differently.
Hmm.
And that's where the journey completes. And when I say complete, it one cycle is done,
Yeah.
right? And we don't, of course, ever stop journeying. As long as we are alive, we keep journeying at higher octaves, if that makes sense. So there will, of course, be another call to adventure. There will be other challenges and other conflicts. So I guess the moral of the journey is really that the point of life is not to create an identity, but to keep breaking it.
Oh,
Every
I
time
love
we
that.
stabilize into an identity, there's a challenge that comes in for you to be able to break it. And
Wow.
come to think of it, evolution is about that. It's about constantly breaking our own identities.
Yes. Yes, definitely. It's about finding those stories and unlearning those stories, and then finding new ones and then unlearning those new stories. So, what you're essentially saying is, when we are going through that massive trauma, which is when life seems to be breaking down, if we can start accepting where we are, which means not staying in denial, that's when we will say yes to this transformation, to the opportunity to transform in the future.
Yes, absolutely. And it's scary to say yes at times, because more often than not, we don't quite know what we're saying yes to in that moment. And yet, all systems don't no longer work. So
Mm,
there's nothing else to say yes to either.
yeah. Yeah, I remember having this conversation with a fantastic psychotherapist who looked after me when I was recovering from cancer. And we happened to be in this one session where I wanted to figure out what next, and we were just not getting anywhere. And you know that communication is not my weak point, but we were just not getting anywhere. And then she said, "Can you draw something?" And she just gave me a blank sheet of paper and some pens. And then I started drawing whatever. I can't remember what stick figures I made. And then it struck me, and I said, the reason why I'm struggling is because I feel that I'm sitting on this tiny canoe, and I know that I've got to let go of the shore because I have to create a new life. I can't just stay stuck here. And I have no idea where I'm going. And the waters are choppy, and I'm just so scared. I'm shit scared. That's what it feels like. And that was a very, very honest response, because as somebody who had planned all her life and provisioned and be prepared for the big bad eventuality, it was just a very scary place to be in, to say, okay, I will see what I become. But I would say that was the most beautiful transformation I have had in my personal life.
It's so important in that moment to commit to oneself, to say that, I might not have a perfect support system. I may not even have other people allowing me to say yes to this. And yet I need to be there for me in that moment, to say yes to whatever my truth is in that moment, without seeking agreement.
Yeah. And I would say that's a big thing, because our family, our friends, people who know us, they want to keep us safe, and we want to keep us safe. And everybody is really scared, and people just want us to be safe, and they would give us a version that might keep us safe but may not really be the right option for us. For example, I think everyone other than you asked me to go back to the corporate world after I recovered from cancer. When I was recovering from cancer, I literally, you were the only person in this wide world, Rukmini, who said, no, go and follow what you want to do, because everyone else was just too scared for me, and I was too scared for myself. So obviously I could see my truth. And I think that's where the power of coaching is. That's where the power of friendship is, when you have somebody who can trust you, who you can trust, and who has faith in you when you don't have faith in yourself. I think that's a magical thing to experience.
It's uh, it's interesting you bring up the point about safety, that yes, all of us want to keep each other safe. And yet, a lot of times conflicts arise because we are married to the strategy of safety rather than to the value of it.
Oh,
Right? So
explain
one
that to
side
us,
decides,
please.
it's like, one side decide that this is how Parul is going to be safe, right? So my strategy for Parul is for her to go back into a job, for her to be safe. Then I keep projecting the strategy onto you, and in the process actually lose out on the value of safety. Right? So it's important for us to reconnect with the intention, with the fact that if I want safety for you, the safety in your new environment may not look like what safety looked like earlier. Right? So what safety might have looked like and was functional in your, let's say, pre-cancer life, right? Uh, that life had a certain set of environmental factors, a support system, and all of that, where safety looked and felt in a certain way, that it had a certain form. Now, when you're no longer there emotionally and mentally, where life has changed, even physically, you can't apply the same strategy.
Yeah, the rules have changed.
Yeah, so it's important that we let go of the form in which we hold our intentions for each other. right? The form in which love needs to be expressed, the form in which safety needs to be expressed, the form in which care needs to be expressed. Very often we're so attached to the form that we forget the intention. And if you're able to plug back and reconnect with the intention, and more often than not, just ask the person that you're trying to support, how would you like to be cared for in this moment, or how would you like to be loved in this moment?
Yeah.
They might have the answer better than the strategy that you're formulating.
Yeah. And how can we help ourselves if we are in a situation where we can't see our own truth, or we are so scared that we can't trust what we are seeing?
Well, if there is a support system around you, yes, by all means, utilize that in terms of people who might be able to not advise, but hold space for you, right? So I, I would think a lot of my time is in times when there is no challenge, right? In times when there is no crisis. A lot of my time is spent in investing in that community, informing that community around me to say, okay, if there is a crisis, who can I go to? And can I invest in those relationships in a manner that that community exists around me in a moment of crisis?
Yeah.
Right? Not in a sense of return on investment, right? So it's not about saying I'm going to invest time and effort in this relationship because I expect a return. But in terms of really forming communities around. So it's not necessary that I might get support from my own community, but the fact that I'm forming communities around in the world means that I'm creating support systems for the world in general. And who knows whose community I might find support in.
Mm. Yes.
But it is up to us to really create those communities in moments of relative peace, so that we can access those support systems in a moment of crisis. But yeah, when that's not available, I would think self-coaching always helps in terms of simply asking myself, what's life trying to tell me right now? What's the opportunity here?
Mm. Yes. Yeah, I find that question very, very powerful. What is the opportunity here? I love what you talk about building communities in times of peace, when there is no conflict, when there's no crisis, so that we can access those resources, those communities, when we actually need them. There are so many people who wait until a crisis hits them before they take action. And when the crisis has hit them, then it's survival time. And then it just doesn't work. Then there is no time, space, or energy available to build that community.
Yeah, and I mean, for a lot of us, I mean, in fact, to generalize, for most of the world around us today, that's what intensifies the trauma. Right? Uh, I mean, if you look at the collective trauma that we're going through in the pandemic now, it's a lot of it is because we've not invested in forming those communities around us pre-COVID. And now, when we're isolated, we're not quite sure where and how to reach out. And when everyone's in a stage where they're scared and tentative and unsure of things, of course, forming community becomes all the more challenging in that space.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
And we are missing out that connection.
yeah.
Despite all our talk of being focused on our individual selves, we are missing out that human connection. And I think that's the biggest loss I have experienced during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. So this was focus on the trauma aspect of the 4 steps that you shared with us. Let's talk a little bit about the next step, the transformation.
Well, For me, I mean, in my personal experience and interpretation of the journey, I find that the transformation part of the heroic journey is something that one needs to allow. It's not something that I do, right? So, I mean, I don't do transformation, but I allow for what is emergent to express through me. So it's about, for example, where, COVID's broken down the regular patterns of work and uh, irregular ways of doing business and all of that. The transformation phase for me is to say, all right, older ways of working are not possible anymore. And I mean, if I have to look at myself, I would think that the first state of the doorway to that trauma was mental for me, in the sense that, oops, life doesn't look the same anymore. I'm spending so much time at home. There's no travel. I'm missing airports, right? So a lot of it is mental and emotional. And then the first step is to, of course, bring my body in to say, okay, so the body now needs to align with this new reality where, of course, I'm missing travel, I'm missing a certain lifestyle and all of that. And therefore, for me, what does it take for me to align my body to this reality, right? I need to cook differently, eat differently, exercise differently, because there is a very tangible change in lifestyle. And so I need to make sure that my body is aligned with that. And and then once the whole of me is aligned spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically, then to say, okay, now how do I transform all of this together? So when I make these minor changes in every aspect of my life, when I change the food I eat, when I change the way I exercise, when I change the way I think about working with a client, when I change the way I connect with or interact with a friend, when all of these things change, the transformation occurs. It's something I need to allow, right? So, in terms of transformation, could be as simple as uh, moving away from the expectation that I have to meet a friend at least once a month for me to keep the friendship alive. To let go of that and to say, okay, meeting's not happening for a few months. How else do I keep it alive? Right. So what happens in the process is I'm letting go of a certain belief that a relationship stays alive in a certain way, to say that, okay, no, a relationship can also stay alive in a different way.
Yeah.
And that's transformation, right? It's change of beliefs that happens at a layer that's so subtle. Sometimes it's not very overt. Sometimes we may not notice it unless somebody else points it out. A lot of times we don't quite notice or name our own transformations because we're too close to it. And what it often entails is really a shift of beliefs, a shift of identity, that who I was is no longer what I am. And it's easier for others to notice it.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't read the label on the jar if you're inside the jar.
Yeah.
What do you mean when you say, I know you've said this a couple of times, but just pick it apart for us to make it more tangible. What do you mean when you say transformation is not something I do, it's something I allow and let it emerge? I want you to talk to those people in the head, action takers kind of people, and make it more tangible for them.
Okay. So let's say, for example, if I want to try and do transformation, okay, and if I want to say, all right, I'm a person who has a short temper, I'm quick to anger, and I'm going to transform myself around this, right? Now, if I have to do transformation, then all I can do is make a plan around it, saying next time something happens, someone triggers me, I'm not going to get angry, right? And if I'm going to take that approach, more often than not, it's not going to work, because
Good luck with that.
well, yeah, I get angry when I get angry, right? So so therefore it's not something that one can plan and strategize and execute, right? It's not as simple as that, because what we are attempting to shift in the process of transformation is our identity. If I've always identified myself as someone with a short temper, that's really deep seated, right? So for me to shift that sense of identity, two things need to happen. One is that the old identity needs to die, right? And something else needs to take its place. So for that old identity to die, there needs to be more than just a plan of saying, I'm not going to get angry any longer. So it needs to be about saying, it's really a lot about observing oneself and becoming conscious about what happens when I'm angry. Right? So if I'm able to, let's say when I'm in the process of having an angry fight with someone, even moments after that, if I'm able to plug back and say, okay, I got angry, I got into a fight, I screamed, shouted, did whatever. What do I notice about my anger? Right? My body was in a certain way. There was a certain muscle getting clenched. There was a contraction somewhere. My voice sounded this way. These were the thoughts running in my head. These were the other emotions I felt along with anger. Maybe there was rage. Maybe I wanted to murder someone. Maybe I was also sad. A lot of times anger is accompanied with sadness, right? So if I'm able to, in moments of anger, even as I express that anger, plug out and also look at all of these other parts of me, right? Physically, mentally, emotionally, what are the other symptoms that I see? And instead of attacking that anger, if I can work with those small symptoms, right? If I can say that, okay, instead of saying next time I'm not going to get angry, if I can say that, okay, when I notice myself in a process of anger, when I'm starting to scream and shout at someone, and I've noticed that more often than not, when I'm doing that, I'm standing up, I'm gesticulating, I'm very animated. The next time around, when I get angry, can I at least make myself sit down? I can continue screaming and shouting, but can I change one symptom? Can I sit down?
Yeah.
Right? That changes the equation, right? So what happens in the process is that the more symptoms I latch on to and the more simple things I start to change, right? So where I'm not attacking the identity of me being short-tempered, but all I'm doing is working with the periphery. I'm working with the body, I'm working with the mind, I'm working with other symptoms. What's happening in the process is I am transforming aspects of me outside in, right? So I'm not attacking the identity. So the identity is not forced to defend itself and come back harder. All I'm doing is really working with the periphery. And the more I work with the periphery, the identity which is at the core cannot hold itself any longer because its environment has changed.
Yeah.
Right? So if I'm used to being angry and stand and shout, the moment I make myself sit, that energy is not available.
Yeah.
Right? The identity cannot sustain because there's nothing feeding it. Right? And so what you're doing in the process is, in a very subtle, gentle way, you're making that identity starve by taking away what feeds it. Right? The body language, the mental space, the emotional space, you're taking away what feeds it. And in the process, that identity starts. And the more you do that, the more intentional you can become about saying, okay, so the next time someone upsets me, how else do I want to respond? If I'm no longer able to scream and shout, how else do I respond? And then that starts slowly building the new identity. And that's the transformation process, right? Where I could adopt different strategies. I mean, I could say that, okay, I'm going to walk away from the person in the moment and maybe come back when I'm calmer. Maybe I take a few deep breaths and start having a conversation, whatever that is, right? Well, one's choice of a new identity can be different. But the point is, what we're doing is shifting the environment, the internal environment largely.
Yeah.
And the transformation happens in the process.
Yeah.
So I'm not doing that transformation. All I'm doing is working with the periphery, and the transformation piece takes its own time, and it works.
I have this mathematical equation going on in my head when I listen to X into Y is equal to Z, where X and Y are different elements of the environment or the system, and Z is how things look. What we are saying is, if we shift Y, no matter how tiny it is, Z is going to change. In this case, X can be the identity that's trying to keep us safe, and we are trying to keep it safe. But even if we change just one tiny thing in Y, Z is bound to change because Z is a product of X and Y. I've nailed it. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So it is not about making one big change suddenly. It's about working with whatever tiny changes we are able to bring about in the environment. And from what I hear, working with our identities or unbecoming those identities seems to be the most important aspect of this work.
Yes, and at the same time, it's not as big as that sounds, right? A lot of times we resist transformation because it sounds so big. It sounds like that there's something so drastic that it's scary. And it doesn't have to be. Sometimes it's about really subtle shifts, which of course create really quantum changes, but it does not have to be scary at all.
And if we go back to what you said right in the beginning, the concept of evolution, well, there can be a big bang that happens, but otherwise evolution happens over there are tiny changes that happen over millions and billions of years. That's how evolution happens.
Yeah.
But we just don't give ourselves that time to change. Oh, I think that's where the challenge is, isn't it?
Well, not sure if it's a matter of time, but a matter of will and opportunity. It's not something that takes too much time, right? It's that decision, inner decision to shift takes just a moment.
Yes, that's true. That is true. And once we make the decision, really make the decision, really say yes to ourselves, as you would say, that's when things start changing. And it's not going to be easy. We aren't saying it's going to be easy. It's going to be messy. And we are going to doubt ourselves several times, but it'll be totally worth it.
Yeah.
And that's how we
not
work
easy does not mean it has to be difficult.
Yeah, obviously.
We tend to polarize it in our heads very often, right? So yeah, it may not be easy, but it doesn't mean it's unpleasant.
Yes, that is true. That is true. And that's how we start birthing into a new us, which is the final step of the model you shared.
Yeah. And the rebirth is organic, right? It's just how you show up in the world when you are transformed. Again, it's not something that's an act. in the sense that it doesn't really require much doing. It's just who you're being once you're transformed.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. If you could share just one message with our audience, what would it be, Rukmini?
Say yes to those calls to adventure.
Beautiful. I took a very long time to say yes to them, but finally got my act in order. And I'm so glad I did. Before we let you.
The say yes is available in our everyday lives, right? So say yes could be when, let's say, my Wi-Fi conks off and in the middle of a call, can I say yes to that adventure to say that, okay, bad day for calls. What else do I do today?
Yeah.
You're saying yes could be as simple as that.
Yes, that is true. That is true. That is true. How can people get in touch with you, Rukmini?
So often through my social media pages. So Facebook and LinkedIn are spaces where I'm fairly active. Also on my email, which is rukmini@exalt-solutions.com. So that's another way to reach me.
When we finish talking, would you be kind enough to drop all your relevant links just underneath this video, please, in the group?
I can do that, yes.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for this beautiful conversation, Rukmini. I thoroughly enjoyed our time together.
Me too. This was such a joy.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the live streaming now. Thank you to everyone who joined us live. Bye.
Bye.